which we're very proud of here in Australia. Now, if I can move on to some conceptual aspects of the problem, first of all, when we look at the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains, I think it's sorry, I see somebody's sent a message to me. Yes, that's great. You can submit the questions. I don't guarantee to be able to answer them as I'm going, though. I'll try, but I don't guarantee it. So when we look at the impact on supply chains, I think it's beholden on us to start by thinking how we're going to assess the way in which supply chains are affected, rather than just plunge into the subject and say this happened and that happened and so on. Can we try to put some sort of rigor into the way that we analyze the problem? And when I looked at this, I think that I can more or less identify a series of input measures and then a series of output measures. And by input measures into this process of change, I identify three in particular. What happened to supply? What are the principal ways in which the availability of supply was affected by COVID-19 or has been affected by COVID-19? And I think when most people think about the impact on the supply chain, they mostly are inclined to think in terms of restrictions on supply of one variety or another. So that's, in a sense, the most obvious one. But it may have many different varieties and different aspects. Secondly, however, and perhaps of equal importance, I think we should assess the impact of the pandemic in terms of its effect on demand as well, because this wasn't a single-sided exercise, hasn't been a single-sided exercise. There have also been important global demand effects. And I should say that I'm approaching this from an entirely global perspective. And one of the things I'm hoping to do at the end of our discussion is to invite you to make contributions specifically on the Indonesian situation, which I have got some information about myself from published sources, but I shall certainly relish the opportunity of talking to you about how you see things from an Indonesian perspective. When we then get to thinking about output considerations, I think then pricing and traded volumes are the key issues for me. So what have been the prices, which have been a function of the pandemic, that have existed during the pandemic time? And what have we seen in terms of consumption and intermediate produce transfers and international trade? Because that's the way that we see the impact on the supply chain. The supply chain completely atrophies, completely seizes up, then the way we would observe this in terms of its effects would be that we wouldn't see any goods transacted. We would presumably see sky-high prices because of a complete lack of supply. And we would also see an absence of international trade. I think on top of this, though, I think in addition to that, I think we can say that there are some substantial regulatory issues that we would want to address and which flow from this consideration. And then when we get to the end of all this, I want to draw my conclusions about how I think supply chains have been affected. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the way that we, as academics, as scholars, looked at the impact on the supply chain early on during the pandemic, and how we look at it now, and what we can say about the relationship between those two. So if I can now start, if I can get going. There we are. Has everyone seen my slide move on now? I hope so, yeah. Yes. Okay. Are we now on a new slide?
Yes, we can see.
Yes, we can see.
Good. Good. Okay. Good. Excellent. Okay. So the fact is that overall, COVID-19 hasn't materially reduced the supply of agribusiness products and agricultural products generally worldwide. So if we look to the most basic figure, and my go-to basic figure is the FAO cereal production figure, we actually see a remarkable degree of consistency that this year the projected output, as you can see, is at getting on for 2,800 million, 2.8 billion tons, a new record, in fact, and steady growth from 2020 and 2019. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the FAO webpage showing cereal output. The latest report was delivered, I think, about 6 days ago, and demonstrated the quantity of output that has been very, very consistent. If you didn't know there was a pandemic, you certainly wouldn't be able to tell by looking at the FAO cereal production figures or the fundamental elements of agricultural production. Now, if we take a step back from that and we look at what people were saying early on in the pandemic about the availability of supply, you get a very, very different picture indeed. So for whatever reason, and it's noticeable that a lot of these figures are coming from the United States, we see a substantial volume of suggestion that farmers, particularly in China, but also in India and elsewhere in the world, were suffering from a chronic lack of inputs and would go on suffering from a chronic lack of inputs, fertilizers in particular. Phosphate was particularly quoted in the Chinese context as being a tremendous and immediate casualty of supply chains, although the International Fertilizer Association, the IFA, was concerned but didn't actually corroborate any of these particular suggestions. And the suggestion was that lack of feed was then resulting in animals having been put to death around the world. These reports that I did for this seminar conduct as much of a survey as I could reasonably be expected to do. It was quite striking that a lot of these suggestions were very anecdotal, and they all seemed to come from the very early days of the pandemic, from around sort of March, April time last year, when undoubtedly there were a wide range of panic reactions of one variety or another, which, had they been sustained, would have had very serious and immediate effects on the availability of supply for a wide range of agricultural products, including basic foodstuffs. What we saw, however, was that the greatest impact tended to be, certainly the level of sustained greatest impact, was in the high value segments, particularly the high value segments, and I'm thinking of exotic fruits, for example, but also leather goods and a number of other areas, and certain refined cotton products and so forth, where there was a high level of labor use. Now, we all know, of course, that the restrictions which were placed on migration and border controls had a very significant effect in those economies which were dependent, which are a relatively small element in the global economy. I mean, Australia is a particular candidate in this regard. But if you look even at the Australian agricultural economy, the majority of revenue, the majority of value, comes from sheep and it comes from grains. And neither of those is particularly dependent on immigrant labour. On the other hand, flower picking in Kenya, or strawberries here in Australia, and a number of other examples, and milk in the US, although we'll come to that because that's a slightly different reason. Those commodities which were highly dependent on migrant workers were seriously affected, and we certainly have had a number of scandals here in Australia with allegations by farmers that they've had to throw away crops, and that they are reducing the level of plantings, or have reduced the level of plantings in relation to the 2021 season. Now, of course, when they do reduce the level of plantings of exotic fruits or otherwise, it doesn't mean their land goes fallow. What it means is that they will turn it over to those crops that are highly labour efficient, particularly the cereal crops, with the result, of course, that cereal production increases. And given that we've seen no particular difficulties on other important aspects of the supply chain, what is the effect of this? It is to reduce choice, but not fundamentally to reduce overall supply, particularly in the areas of fundamentals. In the US, we also saw the fact that the restaurants were closed down very early on in the course of the pandemic, which is something which has been pervasive throughout Europe and elsewhere. This, of course, has had structural transformations in the nature of demand, which I'll come to later on. And as a result of that, of course, there were instances in which things like large quantities of milk were actually thrown away and so forth. So there were examples of this. Oops, that's slipped. I don't know why that's happened. This is a problem with Zoom at the moment. It's coming to be very difficult to shift around slides. Let's go to where I want and keep where I want for a time being. That's where I want to be. Sorry. Right. So what we have not seen, particularly as far as Western supermarkets are concerned, are any prolonged and persistent shortages. It simply hasn't been the case. I'll come to what happened on the demand side, but certainly on the supply side, there have been no persistent shortages in the supply chains in Western supermarkets. Simply didn't happen. Early on, there were a number of outbreaks of COVID-19, in particular, and I'm sure many of you will have read or heard about these, meat processing plants in particular. In the US, in the UK, continental Europe, and elsewhere. And those meat processing plants, I mean, overall, we've had, somewhere in the region of 1,800 examples of this. Daily processing volumes of beef and pork in the US were 40% below their 2019 levels during the last week of April and the first week of May 2020. And the federally imposed slaughter volumes there were down about just over 20%, about a fifth, compared to their 2019 levels in the period from April to June. So Lusk wrote some very good stuff on this. And there have been some updated reports there. I've put all the stuff into the bibliography so you can go and see it. And indeed, what we saw was that a very substantial meat processing plants, of course, were ideal places in which COVID-19 could breed. And at its peak, about almost 10% of the US meat processing workforce was actually infected with COVID-19, and there were outbreaks in just under 240 facilities. And this wasn't just in the US, as I say, it happened in Canada, it happened in Brazil, it happened in Europe, and so forth, all over the world. And when we remember that a lot of this is a particularly concentrated industry. So, for example, in Canada, 3 packing plants account for 85% of slaughter capacity. it's not surprising that slaughter capacity declined rapidly, and people were genuinely concerned that they wouldn't be able to get their meat. And isn't it interesting that if you look back on, not that I'm advocating any sort of conspiracy theory here at all, of course not, but it is interesting to see that what happened in 2020 and the effect of COVID was to encourage humanity as a whole towards what has widely been regarded as the future of food consumption, more vegetable-based, and a number of other things. It's an interesting point. It's probably no more than a coincidence, but it is interesting nonetheless. So, what people at the time said was that there were a lot of short-run effects, and that is undoubtedly true. And there were lags in the system to be able to deal with the changes in market conditions. So obviously differences in the lengths of breeding cycles, long breeding cycles for cattle, short ones for broilers and so forth. And the perishable nature of agricultural commodities in particular was a constraint. Obviously, as you know, dairy farmers have to deliver daily. Fruit and vegetables have to be harvested when they're ripe. You can't just store them indefinitely, and so forth. Obviously, we were used to this kind of problem from adverse weather or other events of affecting supply chains, but when reinforced in the short term with changes in relation to the demand, which happened very quickly, there were some very substantial changes. In the West, in particular, this temporary closure of packing plants, when combined with the changes in demand, which, as I'm going to argue, are a little more persistent, resulted in some changes in price spreads, which were again temporary, and I think that's really important to make that point. It's also important, I think, from my perspective as an international agribusiness advocate as much as scholar, to say that the academic consensus now is that even if there had been a very different supply chain system, localizing and so forth would have made very little difference to this kind of problem. The effect on processing of meat in particular would not have been substantially altered by changing and localizing production. It's interesting to see, we're talking about Indonesia, it's interesting to see the latest comments about this. And again, I very much caution that this is based on this research during the early phase of the pandemic, which I think one should be extremely cautious about. But the paper by Cerny, which I've been reading recently on the effect on the broiler industry in Indonesia, very interesting, because what they suggest is that the result there was oversupply, which then led to a decrease of price on the chicken in the market. And price disparities amongst the region were large. Price movements became, over a very short space of time, really quite extreme in his argument. The labour supply, of course, was declined because of various forms of lockdown and so forth, and the supply chain system was relatively disrupted. Cerny makes a very interesting distinction between different areas in the country, in fact, so that in areas with stable demand, high prices and lower purchasing power became the consequence because of the temporary layoff of many workers. But the consequence of that overall was that producer profits decreased. So the argument went. But it's interesting that even Cerny's argument can only suggest that whilst the average share received by breeders, and I'm very keen on this point, ranged between 46.64% and 47.89%. The COVID-19 panic, the pandemic, pushed this to the tremendous difference of 49.59%, not even 50%. A movement of what, 5%, 3% in the overall total. I mean, you'd have more of an effect from a typhoon, quite frankly, than you would from the effect of COVID-19 on this argument. Another interesting point that I would make now, and I will carry it over, is that Cerny's article has in common with many other commentaries on what happened to supply during the pandemic, in that he intermingles recommendations with facts. And this has become a hallmark of commentary about the whole affair. And he actually talks about the idea of chicken meat being sold at lower than normal prices, and by that he means under 2%, within the normal range of circulation of prices, and making the point, he says, that if prices decrease, consumer demand will increase. Well, no, of course, because if the demand curve falls by more than the supply curve falls, then you will still get a fall in price, even though the supply curve has changed. And the time frame was relatively small, as I say, in which this and many other such studies done during the time. On transportation, I think we can say with reasonable clarity that COVID-19 actually improved access to transport. I mean, we know that there are two factors. And one is that large ocean freighters generally have very small amounts of crew. I mean, with the exception of the completely paranoid Australian authorities in their relation to Philippine transport here and so forth, and mandating that they stand offshore and so forth, it is perfectly possible to have crews remain on board and not actually come on shore at all. Most of the transfer of bulk commodities is done remotely. There's no need for any physical. The only point at which they actually interact is when pilots have to go on board ships to bring them into harbour. There's very little community transmission of COVID required from international bulk shipping of commodities. And so that's been a tremendous advantage with respect to agricultural commodities. And indeed anything containerized as well. So one thing is that the crews are relatively small. The Philippines has been an issue, but generally the crews have been relatively isolated. But also, as my point here, taking up on Gray's article, which has been well reported, the fact that access by agricultural commodities to the whole range of transportation issues, to rail freight, to ocean freight, and even to trucking. Although in the case of trucking, there were some, again, temporary problems caused by a lack of exemptions to truck drivers in some jurisdictions and so on, although here we had it right from the start. Sorry? Here we had it right from the start that interstate truck drivers were always exempted from any restrictions on supply chains right from the start of the pandemic, and that went right the way through and has continued to be the case. So access to all of these, generally speaking, improved. And the reason it did, of course, was that agriculture suddenly stood forth as the number one client, the number one requirement, the number one demand issue. And so other sectors fell back, agribusiness came up to take the place, and so a lot of the bottleneck problems didn't exist. Now, of course, at an early stage during the pandemic, there was a widespread fear that major ports like La Plata and Rosario in Argentina and so on, you all know the importance of Brazil in particular in the global agribusiness trade, were going to be shut down because of COVID, and they wouldn't be able to continue. And that would and I'd be the first to admit this, that would have had a catastrophic effect on international trade and the supply of many processed goods, soybeans most obviously, but meats, dairy products and so forth. And had the main ports of major exporting countries or importing countries been closed down as a result of COVID, that really would have had the kind of colossal effect that a sustained typhoon season would have had. But that didn't happen. And so the fears that many had put out at an early stage that would take place didn't transpire. The result was that, generally speaking, the problems were relatively limited. There were some examples of border thickening, so differences in sanitary and phytosanitary measures, but these have always been around. But generally speaking, scholars are agreed that COVID-19 did not weaken the integrity of cross-border agri-food supply chains. Generally speaking, food and agricultural products were allowed to flow relatively straightforwardly. There were some exceptions. The Chinese in particular, and I think we have to accept that some of this was intensely political. You're all aware of the Australian-Chinese trade dispute, of course, and that has precious little to do with COVID and an awful lot to do with geopolitics, as I'm sure you're aware. And China, in many cases, actually did things like put short-term quarantine on incoming ships in China. And there were even, in a number of places, temporary restrictions on foodstuff imports because it wasn't clear early in the pandemic exactly how porous different packaging materials were to COVID, nor how long COVID would survive on packaging materials. That we've got a much greater understanding of that now. We're aware of the fact that it is almost impossible to imagine that salmon or otherwise would have carried COVID into China. It sounded pretty ridiculous at the time. And of course, the Norwegians worked patiently through with the Chinese to deal with these kinds of problems. But there were relatively low levels of this kind of interruption to trade caused by concerns, in particular over COVID. So I think on the whole, the transportation aspect of all of this, went relatively well in relation to the impact. And certainly without that relative success of the transportation networks globally, we would have been in severe difficulties, even if there hadn't been much problem with the availability of supply, and even if there hadn't been substantial effects on the next one. And the next one, in terms of the input segments, so I move forward on income segments, we can see what absolutely happened overall as to where we went. And my summary, my strapline summary for this slide, as you can see, is that no, COVID-19 did not reduce the demand for agribusiness products overall. It did not. In some cases, due to the way that that lockdowns worked, what we actually found was the demand for certain agricultural products and agribusiness products actually increased. And obviously there were some really substantial short-term effects, which we'll come to in a minute. But looking at what drove the results overall, what we can see is that there were essentially three components to the change in demand that were caused during the course of the pandemic. The first one was, particularly in the West, as I'm sure you're aware, the government coffers were opened and substantial quantity of loans and in some cases grants were advanced to businesses and individuals in order to get them through the pandemic while they were in lockdown. Now, what do people do? It's perfectly obvious. What do people do when they're trapped inside their own homes and they can't go out and they're being supplied with money? Well, obviously what they do is eat. And that's exactly what happened. We may have stored up something of a public health problem for ourselves along the road here, and we certainly are. So, for example, alcohol consumption increased in the UK, although not interestingly in Europe, but in the UK particularly it did. And that may pose public health problems down the road. Nevertheless, this widespread support to unemployed and underemployed people, a leveling of the economy, did mean that there was an artificial injection of demand when it was required during the period when lockdowns were in existence, and that meant that you did not have quantities of agricultural produce or otherwise going to rot on supermarket shelves. Quite the contrary. And of course, as we know, when you carry out that kind of transfer of resources, and it was quite a distributional change, the effect is going to be markedly felt amongst those people who have, with very low income elasticities of demand for food. Food is not going to be adversely affected, and indeed that's exactly what we found. We found packed supermarket shop columns and aisles and so forth with people spending. So the process went continually. That's quite different from the experience in developing countries, where we know from the ample reporting of the FAO and UNCTAD and the United Nations generally, that COVID-19 has exacerbated already extant problems with respect to dietary needs. And we know that there are, again, anecdotal examples of supply chain difficulties actually resulting in lower income groups being unable to access sufficient food. What we don't have is even anecdotal reports of mass starvation as a direct result of COVID. We've got plenty of evidence of what violence and communal hatred and a whole lot of other things do in terms of preventing people from accessing food, but we do not have evidence that COVID-19 itself has caused mass starvation. And there were those who were talking about that, and I'll come later on to the wider geopolitical issue of how the COVID-19 supply chain was actually treated from this regard. The second thing is that we did have, initially anyway, a lot of panic buying. No doubt about that. I mean, we saw it ridiculously here. I think people are still trying to get through their supplies of toilet rolls now, 1 year after they went and collected hundreds of the things. Completely ridiculous. Throughout the West, there was a substantial quantity of panic buying, and every time a lockdown actually happened, people rushed out and started making these purchases until they realized that the supply chains were actually much more resilient than they feared, and therefore they didn't have to worry about it so much. Clearly, that kind of panic buying obviously upends normal supply chain operations. But it subsided, and it has stayed subsided. So we've seen much less in the way of panic buying than we saw before. If you compare that, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, admittedly, I was a child, but I do remember the 1973 oil price crisis. Which was probably the single largest economic shock that the post-war economic system actually faced, when the oil price spiked by 100% or more in a relatively short space of time. Now, you want to see panic buying, you see that's panic buying. You just can't get petrol at all for weeks and weeks. And imagine what the effect on an economy of not being able to get fuel actually is. That's a really substantial damage to the supply chain. And of course, back in 1973, supply chains were much weaker, much less resilient than they are now. The third component of the demand aspect of this, I would suggest, is what happened to the retail sector. Now, in reality, the retail sector was already under very significant change and impact long before COVID. This has been going back for years, admittedly not so obvious, perhaps, in some developing countries, although goodness me, GoFood and so forth in Indonesia and its equivalents around the world were already having a major effect well before COVID. So the retail sector was already, restaurants in particular, were already suffering substantially well before COVID got anywhere there. And when COVID did strike, of course, we found that delivery services became critically important in doing the last mile aspect of supply chains and maintaining demand levels, getting to the necessary customers, even in those jurisdictions that were actually locked down. Now, there were some changes as a result of this sudden shift, acceleration of shift. It was already there, but accelerated. From food service to food retail, people avoiding restaurants and public venues because they were afraid or because they were told they couldn't go and because they were closed down and so forth. The UK is only just now reopening its food service sector now. So what happened was that food supply chains then very quickly turned on a dime, as the expression has it, and geared up to supply the food sector to adapt to these different product offerings. And this happened worldwide. So packaging size changed, products changed, distribution channels required, like GoFood, changed as well, and they all changed together. It was a very good thing that people could see it coming from about 10 years away, because all the procedures and processes were all there. What happened, and you can draw a parallel with what happened in terms of WFH, working from home. You can see that people were ready for it long before it came. COVID-19 effectively opened the doors to what was in the process of being transformed in supply chains already. So in the poultry sector, for example, demand for chicken wings and other products, poultry products, which were popular in food service outlets, plummeted. This is an example, I think, from Canada, but you can replicate this around the world. And demand for breaker eggs, which is used in processing, also dropped significantly. In the dairy sector, the fact that consumers were remaining at home and the temporary closure of cafes, and I plead guilty to being a latte addict myself. So of course I'm very keen to see cafes opened, as they have been here throughout the crisis, with the exception of a few days. There are large falls in the demand for cream and for cheese in the food retail sector, only partially offset by increases in the household demand for things like yogurt and butter and fluid milk and so forth. And similar patterns were observed from early March, and they were put through into a systemic change, which had locked in by about October and has now more or less continued. But also people in those sectors are now well prepared to be able to reverse those changes during the course of probably the tail end of this year, and perhaps, if not next year, when they will be able to reverse back into a previous structure of demand and supply. Finally, of course, we have some really sort of quirky changes, like increases in demand for ethanol, for sanitizers and so forth, that have existed. But that's broadly what we've got in terms of the position with respect to demand. But overall, as I say, the demand position did not particularly change. So if we now move on to considering the output from this, and I think that given the way that I've presented these three pillars of inputs, it's really not dreadfully surprising to see what happened to prices during the pandemic. Now, there are some strategic reasons for this, and Barrett makes the particular point about energy prices being a significant component of the production costs for agribusinesses, which in turn means that one can keep the costs down to a considerable degree. And I think that's fair. It's also worth pointing out that there has been an increase in food prices. It's not as if we're in an environment where we've continued to have level prices. That much I readily concede. If we look at the latest FAO price index, for example, published only the other day, the overall index is sitting at 127.1 in nominal terms, which is 5.8 points higher than it was. That's almost 5% than April, and about and 36.1 points, which is 39.7%, 40% above the same period last year. That is, I readily concede, a very significant impact. And undoubtedly, a lot of that has to do with the planting decisions which were made, and the animal husbandry decisions which were made at the beginning of the pandemic, which then led to the sowing and planting decisions last year, which have now materialized. And it's true that the May increase is the largest, biggest month-on gain since October 2010. And the 12th consecutive, and this is the interesting point, the 12th consecutive monthly rise in the value of that point. An entire year of rising to its highest value since September 2011. And the index is now not above, but actually 7.6 points below the peak value, which was 137.6, recorded in February 2011. So let's just rewind that story again and say again, despite what has been regarded as the largest threat to agribusiness supply chains since World War II, and despite the fact that the pandemic has affected and was said to be affecting dramatically demand structures, supply, availability of supply, and transportation issues for a whole year, the result of this phenomenal crisis is to take us to 7.6% below the level of a food price index caused largely, for those of you who will recall, by speculative price investment in commodities during the 2007 to 2009 period, which then flowed forward into food prices in 2010, 2011. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the significant impact of this increase in food prices. It's definitely there. We haven't had food price riots in 50 countries. But then I think people have got other things to think about other than this. And of course, because their expenditure has been reduced in other areas, they've been better able to absorb the higher food prices which have existed. And the result of that, when the statistics are eventually worked out in terms of the percentage of a household expenditure which has been committed to food during the COVID crisis, that undoubtedly will show a substantial rise, commensurate with the increasing importance of agribusiness generally. But there hasn't been a crisis akin to 2007 to 2011, and there's clearly not going to be. And if you look why that's the case, the classic mechanism that you use to determine whether there's going to be a subsequent rapid increase in food prices is the stock-to-use ratio. Where are we with stocks, which operate as a buffer, of course, in relation to food price appreciation? And where are we in relation to demand relative supply? Well, yes, it's up, but it's not up to crisis levels. It's not up to the levels that were in existence in 2011, and the World Bank spotted this last year, which is why they were much more relaxed about the crisis than some of their compatriots at the IMF and the FAO and elsewhere. And we'll come a bit later on to talking about why that might be. So then when we start to disaggregate prices a little bit further, we start to see that actually there's more to be said about this, because the cereal prices have not been up, but because of the shifts in demand, the meat and dairy prices are definitely not keeping pace with this. Yes, we did see this particular spike in terms of processed meat spreads because of this fear of relatively long periods of meat processing plant closures, but that proved temporary as well, and so the spike gradually vanished, and the processing margins now globally are pretty much back to where we expected them to be. So we certainly can't see a tremendous drama coming out from pricing. What about traded volumes? Where are we with that? Well, this is sort of the real core of how COVID-19's impact on the supply chain would be manifested. We would start to see, as I commenced this lecture by saying, we would start to see some pretty substantial changes around the world. We know that for a number of crops, I mean, Canadian canola, for example, 3/4 of that is exported. So if there were substantial holdups or reductions in trade, we would be seeing a very considerable decline in those levels of exports, and we didn't see that. What we actually saw in the 2020 UNCTAD, which keeps the statistics on international trade, an organization that I've been proud to be associated with for approximately 25 years now. We see that international agribusiness trade actually went up year on year by 3% in Q2 and 7% in Q3 last year. Those are year-on-year figures. And my anticipation is that when we see the Q4 figures and the Q1 2021 figures, we will see similar, if not better, figures in respect of international agribusiness trade. So what we saw in 2020 generally, COVID-19 and the IMF, I think now has, the USDA has just produced an excellent report on this, which I've been reading. And so in 2020, COVID-19 rattled the world economy, disrupted international trade flows generally, caused capital to fly around the world in some extraordinary ways. The two sectors that did very, very well, real estate, of course, not development particularly, but investment and agribusiness, twin pillars of capital stability during 2020. Even during the initial wave of infections and lockdowns and so on, agribusiness trade actually only fell by 2% globally, 2%. As I say, a bad typhoon season could do more than that. And ended the year up 3.5% overall. Now, that doesn't mean that the trade flows were completely insulated, as the USDA has pointed out, from the effects of the pandemic. So, in fact, a lot of and other things were happening in the world in 2020, strange as it may seem to relate, but other factors were going on in the world apart from just this. And in China in particular, which was a major element of this, of agricultural demand and trade, of course. 95% of global agricultural trade growth came from China and was driven by non-pandemic related factors such as increased feed demand for all these animals that early on they said they were slaughtering, but of course they were not, efforts to restock grain reserves and various other policy factors. Empirical analysis does show from the USDA, in that USDA paper, looked at the impact, it's very interesting, looked at the impact of COVID-19 incident rates, the restrictions imposed by government, and reduced human mobility, of course, which I mentioned earlier on trade. And the COVID-induced reduction on global agricultural trade, which was rather disparate depending on different sectors, at a maximum was around 10%, which somewhat almost an order of magnitude less, at least 2 or 3 times less, the impact on non-agricultural trade. Non-food items, things like hides and skins, ethanol, cotton, other commodities, meat products, including seafood, and higher value agri-food products, specialty foods, chilled foods, and so on. These were the ones that were most affected by the pandemic. I have to say we haven't seen too much of that effect here in Australia, but that's almost certainly because the vast majority of our higher value agri products are actually produced domestically, and so we don't see that effect. But it certainly has had an effect on higher value agricultural products and those chains elsewhere. The vast majority of agricultural supply chains and bulk commodities, the effect of the pandemic, the USDA now concludes, are limited, or they say even positive. The policy restrictions imposed by importing countries to reduce human morbidity were the main drivers of whatever trade losses they actually had. So the USDA figures demonstrate that the non-food agricultural commodities, the hides and skins, were the highest. They reckon about 15% maximum. Ethanol down about 10%, notwithstanding demand for sanitizer. Cotton down 7%. That's really quite important because a lot of people were not replacing their clothing items, and so cotton's under some threat. Nursery flowers, horticulture very badly affected, generally down by 6%. Rubber, another natural rubber, down about 5%. Those were the highest impacts. Meat products, 5%, seafood and beef and so forth, beef down 4%. poultry down 3%, pork 2%. The most serious reductions. Distilled spirits, tea and sugar and sweeteners, sugar falling quite substantially in price as well, were amongst other areas of agri-food that have had significant negative effects. But overall, the position is that that generally trade has held up quite substantially. And that's because, as we've seen, the agribusiness switching supply from restaurants and food service to retailers, volumes increased. There were, of course, examples of some losses. Probably it's fair to say that during 2020, losses throughout the supply chain, always the curse of the whole agribusiness supply chain, probably accelerated. There were some examples of fruit and vegetables being thrown away early on in the crisis, again anecdotal, certainly not generalizable, and met with government action which was reasonably prompt. This from Malaysia. Other examples were that because of the changing in demand patterns, Belgian farmers were forced to throw away certain types of potatoes because these were consumed in restaurants and bars but not at home and so forth. And that probably applied to Portuguese chicken as well, which was something which was never, generally speaking, consumed in restaurants but only at home. So I would expect to see an increase in Portuguese chicken logic, because there are some agribusiness products which tend to be consumed only in the restaurant setting. It's interesting that when you look, and I took a look for this lecture at the effect on agribusiness at the sharp end, at the valuation end. Again, relatively moderate changes. No really substantial changes in enterprise value to EBITDA ratios or publicly quoted PE ratios, and a slight shift, perhaps even somewhat exaggerated by Moss Adams, really, when you look at the figures. Certainly when you look at 2021 by comparison to 2020, a little bit of a tilt perhaps to land and food production away from some of the more exciting venture capital investments that were taking place during 2017, 18 and 19, but nothing very much. And of course, the fact that the Chinese were now employing and have employed many more drones, a lot more AI and so forth during the pandemic in the supply chain, probably is going to result in still more venture capital investment into those areas, because of course, as we know, robots and AI and so forth are a very effective way of reducing COVID-19 transmission along the supply chain. So there's a lot to be done in terms of potential investment, and I think that although M&A activity has been a little subdued, I see no evidence. If you didn't know there was a pandemic, you certainly wouldn't be able to tell it from M&A statistics of agribusiness around the world generally. What we do see, and this report on Indonesia is typical, what we do see is possibly, and we now start to get into the levels of speculation, and so we start to get concern about the veracity of all of this, the tangibility of it. But we do seem to see that people are now reluctant to consider eating out. I certainly am in the 5%. I shall be keen to do so around the world as soon as I can. And I suspect that 5% will grow quite dramatically once the pandemic is over. But I can only suspect that, of course. I can't prove it. What we do know at the moment is that there has been that structural transformation accelerated towards being at home. And what the effect on agribusiness supply chains down the road is going to be is likely to be seen much more at the retail end than it is at the production and the wholesale end, at least in terms of value added, in terms of methodologies for analysing their performance, in terms of valuations, in terms of all the normal means that we would undertake to do so. So that's the pattern with respect to traded volumes. In that case, if I could now move on, if my slide will let me move on, of course, if I'm not trapped forever here, we can now start to look for some explanations for this, if I may call it, relative stability. And I think that when we look back on the COVID-19 pandemic as agribusiness scholars, and we look to see what the significance of different stakeholders was, and certainly those that were proactive, I think we'll see that government's response worldwide to the threat posed by COVID to food and so forth can be regarded as one of the major contributors to the degree of stability that markets exhibited during what could potentially have been a much more prolonged period of volatility. As with all overdetermined scenarios, of course, we can't be sure the extent to which government's intervention in the marketplace contributed positively to the outcomes. We know what they did, but we can't exactly trace through very easily what the consequences were on food and agribusiness. But what we can say with clarity is what governments actually did do. And the first thing we can say is that worldwide, very quickly and very immediately, a whole series of panicked and well-planned panicked reactions, if you excuse the oxymoron, swung into action very quickly so that transportation and farming were immediately designated as essential services everywhere, as they were here in a highly agricultural area. I live in the wheat belt of Western Australia, surrounded by agriculture, as they were in Scotland, as they were in Indonesia and the United States and Canada, and the bread baskets in Brazil and so forth. It's been really interesting. I've been working with colleagues in Brazil during the course of the pandemic, and the agricultural cooperatives have been continuing to act. The rating agencies have been continuing to rate and change ratings as required. The lenders have been continuing to lend to the agricultural cooperatives. The Brazilian agricultural cooperative industry appears, though there have obviously been personnel impacts in terms of structure and performance, they have been able to continue more or less unhindered by the pandemic, and perhaps that has something to do with the way that the government in Brazil has haphazardly handled the pandemic. That's certainly true, but it's equally the case in a jurisdiction like Australia, where the government has taken an absolutely opposite position with respect to the pandemic, a zero tolerance attitude towards COVID, but nonetheless, agricultural products have remained exemptions. So that transportation and farming essential services focus was absolutely key, undoubtedly, as that Brown article pointed out, in terms of the access to the US and other markets worldwide. So that's one important factor that governments undoubtedly have been involved in. Governments didn't overreact either, and that was another crucial aspect of this. Again, I had a look around at some of the quasi-academic and even actual academic publications. And I mentioned earlier on this point about blurring, the way the pandemic blurred the division between analysis and policy recommendation. And it's an interesting point that it really did, because traditionally, I think it's fair to say that in scholarly analysis, and I value this very much, policy recommendations tend to be put at the conclusion of an analysis, and they are strictly limited to the policies which flow directly from the analysis which has been conducted in the paper. So if it can be demonstrated that a particular subsidy, let's say, is resulting in an inequitable distribution of resources or an inadequate investment profile, then of course the policy recommendation is to remove that inefficient subsidy. And that I think comes under the category of reasonable, deductible policy conclusions and recommendations flowing directly from the analysis to be presented in the paper. But that kind of logic more or less went out of the window temporarily during the course of the pandemic. So we found academic papers calling for policy measures, dramatic policy measures, which were completely unsubstantiated by the very limited degree of empirical analysis that the papers had managed to achieve. And that wasn't surprising, because the papers were rushed are hot off the press in the early stages of the pandemic. And one begins to sense, and I have to say I'm not a full-time academic, and so perhaps I can be forgiven for making this point, that there was a sense of, I want to get published first about this, and I want to be the first person to talk about redeploying workers, or instituting rationing in shops, or introducing vouchers for food amongst lower income segments of the population, or any other of these traditional crisis panic measures which were being advocated, as I say, not just by the IMF, for example, but also by, which has been often has a very misallocated reputation for not saying radical things. It does, but also by academics. And you can go and read some of these papers, some of them talking about the radical measures that they're suggesting that governments really ought to take. But in fact, government's measures were relatively measured. And one of the reasons for that was, of course, that they were dealing with vast numbers of people, as in Indonesia, and significant quantities of resources. And it wasn't practical to introduce some of these kinds of schemes that one has seen in the past. I draw a parallel myself here in the way that particularly quasi-academic institutions were reacted to the COVID pandemic, to the way they reacted to the food price spike, when there were calls for the building of massive government grain reserves and price management policies and so on, none of which were ever actually likely to be implemented because, bluntly, they were too expensive and nobody was going to do it. And the same pretty much applied here. Common sense may have triumphed, but I think that common sense probably triumphed because the kind of radical policies that were being proposed fell into the too hard bucket rather than the category of things that people actually thought were a bad idea. On the contrary, many countries, of course, have targeted assistance to farmers. And if you take the Canadian example, for example, Canada has had a large number of reports on the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the agribusiness industries generally. You can see that they expanded the farm support quite substantially. I guess I can see this point about what happens if COVID continues. I'll answer that in just a second when I've come down to the end of this. So in targeted assistance to farmers, so agri-insurance being expanded, and interestingly enough, also expanded to cover the relevant losses, such as the inability to provide fertilizers or others, or labor shortages and so forth, as eligible risks. So that helped smooth farm incomes. And in fact, what you can see is that in the overall view of incomes at the farm level, you can actually see that farm incomes during the course of 2020, 2021 actually exceeded non-farm incomes during the pandemic as a result of this kind of distribution. Now, in addition to that, we've also seen that the calls, which had been going on anyway at an international level, for issues of national food security to be looked at in more depth, were also reinforced during the course of the crisis. And what was really interesting, I thought was really interesting, and if you read what the United Nations has to say about this, is that the issues of food security became linked up very much with the COVID crisis. So they were sort of combined in that sense, and somewhat sort of uneasily combined, really, because they don't sit very easily together. It didn't follow that greater local food production or a less concentrated processing industry or any of those things would actually result in a better performance with respect to food security during the pandemic. The overwhelming evidence is that the main determinant of food security is greater income. That's what academics have generally concluded, and that indeed these calls for national agribusiness resilience, local food production, dispersing processing industry, providing more support for farmers and all the rest of it, whilst they are politically very appealing, and they're certainly something that the UN will continue to call for, and even the FAO does this from time to time, they don't actually result in anybody having a superior food security position. But there was certainly, what's happened is that these things got linked up together. And in practice, of course, as they have been for many, many years, the calls went unheeded. Nobody did anything about them. So the attempts that were made, and there were a lot of such attempts, to link the pandemic to global food security issues largely failed. And they failed, I think, again, for the worst of reasons. They failed not because they failed because each country, each jurisdiction was busily engaging in an us-first policy environment. Every government became like Trump's government. And so in that context, no one was willing to share. As you know, there have been enough difficulties sharing vaccines, let alone sharing agribusiness. And so food security was not promoted or developed or enhanced in any particular way, either positively or negatively during the course of the crisis. And it's an interesting a quote there that I've ended there from those Canadian academics. What catastrophic price increase or food shortage occurred in Canada during this pandemic that warrants consideration of alternative food systems? The answer is none. And I think that what this demonstrates is that the food security system has during the pandemic performed extremely well. In answer to this particular question, if the pandemic extends to 2021, it depends what you mean by extends. If you mean that the pandemic extends in the sense that we are continually unable to travel freely around the world, then I don't think that has overwhelming consequences for agri-food production or for the ability of basic foodstuffs and for the majority of the ability of production and so forth to continue. In fact, I think that ironically, if we had some sort of stability, if we knew now that the pandemic as we know it now was likely to continue until at least December, then that would give some degree of assurance to farmers and to other businesses as to how they would actually plan and go forward. That doesn't apply to other sectors of the economy. Most obviously, of course, it doesn't apply to airlines, which are desperate and are in very serious financial straits. But it does apply, I think, to the agribusiness food supply chain. And I hope I'm not speaking entirely from an Australian perspective here. I do not get the sense that extending the crisis on into December 2021, as it is indeed, I think, likely to continue, at least in some form, until December 2021, is likely to give us an overwhelming problem in that period. I think if the crisis continues on into next year, I think we are likely to see some reduction in the diversity of supply, and that will mean that in economies that have been experiencing a wider diversity of different forms of production and supply, I think that will be restrained very considerably. So, for example, I think the switch out of cassava in Africa is likely to slow down. I think that developing sophisticated wheat products, again in the African context, is likely to slow down. The introduction of further supermarkets is likely to slow down. The process will be slowed. But I don't think it will have a fundamental effect on supply chain's ability to transmit food from where it's produced to where it's needed to be consumed, nor do I think it will have a fundamental effect on the value chain structures that exist currently in the supply chain. difficult as it is to lock those down, because of course we don't have an overwhelming quantity of information about how those supply chains do relate in terms of values. Studies of that are relatively rare. So if I can sort of bring this discussion together now to some extent, I think that there is an issue about the whole way that the academic profession in particular, but some elements of the quasi-academic world approach the impact of COVID-19 on the supply chain initially. And when we look back on this, I think we've got some really important questions to ask and to answer. And here you have an example of a summary slide which presents the multiplicatory effect, and I think that's what's being argued here, the cumulative multiplicatory effect of a series of long and short-term changes, which together, if you look at this slide and you look at it and you think about what the consequences are going to be on the supply chain, you think, my goodness, this is going to have an enormous effect. And you can see it's categorized here in 6 columns, 6 relationships. But each of these, I think, we have tackled in different ways. The demand shift, the shortening of supply chains, consumers dealing with directly and so forth, the inability of online sites to fulfill orders, changes in consumer buying patterns, lots of sickness and low productivity, worker safety and so forth as a result of the pandemic, allegedly. Lots of security, shopping behavior changing, PPE, space requirements all changing and so forth, safety issues, all the rise of contactless happening. I personally see no more rise of contactless in shopping than there was before the pandemic globally. It was happening because of economic factors which make it cheaper, and that's what's driving it, nothing else. And then finally, food waste of one variety or another, lack of migrant workers and oversupply and so forth. As you can see here, a crisis being portrayed. But the reality was that we did not have a crisis. None of these things interreacted in the way that people thought they were going to, and that scholars were avidly portraying, where are we, just a little over a year ago. And I think it really behoves us to stand back and realize that we have been analyzing agribusinesses and agribusiness supply chains now for a century. And yet we get published in reputable journals from sincere people slides like this. And we really have to sit back now and start to ask ourselves, why did this happen? Why did we underestimate supply chain resilience so badly? Because in my analysis of the work that was done last year, particularly, which many of the authors are now trying to portray in a rather different light, but if you read them carefully, they're very clear that that kind of crisis was exactly what they had in mind. So I think that the answers to why this is are partly things that we could have done something about, and partly things that could have been solved by a more scenario-based approach to writing. The word "if" would have been useful in this context. There were an awful lot of coulds and shoulds. I don't think I've ever seen so many coulds and shoulds in academic articles as over the effect of the pandemic last year. But without wishing to become overly positivistic, I do think there is a strong case for sticking to the facts in significant measure, and a lot more in the way of case studies and actual empirical investigation of supply chains would have been better than the polemics which actually emerged. But I think, in fairness to those people writing, all of us were uncertain about the potential severity of the pandemic in terms of its longevity, and particularly in terms of how severely it was going to affect workers, how it was going to affect the practical aspects of the supply chain. And had it done so, had it really started to affect lorry drivers and so forth, there would have been significant impacts. It's worth saying that back in 1968, there was the Hong Kong flu. At one point in the UK, for example, half the train drivers of the UK were off sick. And even in 1968, this didn't actually stop the ability of supply chains actually to work. So I think we should have looked back and seen that pandemics have a certain structural quality to them, and perhaps we could have been a little more aware of the way that people would recover relatively quickly from COVID-19 and go back to work, and we had more ability to be resilient on the human side than people were talking about. We also definitely, and I think this is where, as scholars, I think we do have a degree of responsibility we need to own up to. We did underestimate the ability of supply chains to react, to flow around these problems, to change their product distribution networks, to change their product profiles and their product portfolios and so forth. And the speed with which they did it, I think, certainly impressed commentators. And I think that we underestimated that, and we need to look at why we underestimated that. I think we also failed collectively to understand the way that government was going to deal with trade, and the way it was going to prioritize trade and make exceptions to trade. I think we almost got into thinking that if we can't travel, then commodities can't travel. And of course, that's not true. It wasn't true 50, 100 years ago when we couldn't afford to travel. We could still have a measure of international trade. We had the cotton trade well before we had passenger trade to North America, for example. And I think we failed to understand the significance of that lax regulation on international trade and the way that agribusiness was prioritized. And the points I made earlier about the way that with the decline in other areas, agribusiness was going to fill up the void in terms of hiring of ships and so forth. I think we also didn't realize the way that certainly in the West, there was going to be such a prompt and vigorous impact on demand through the stimulus. I think that's undoubtedly right. I'll come back to these questions in just a second when I finish doing this, making my points. So I think the stimulus, the effect of the quantity of the stimulus was underestimated. The effect of it was certainly not fully appreciated. And I think if people had known in advance, if these academics commentating on the markets had known, I think that we would have been more cautious in talking about the significant effect of COVID-19. I don't think people expected governments to behave quite so sensibly. Governments are not renowned for behaving sensibly under all occasions, but the fact they didn't take precipitous action and that was very careful and coordinated international action, I think probably a major factor as well. Also, the fact that resources were able to be transferred to agribusiness in terms of bank money, in terms of workers, in terms of government facilitation and so forth. There was no lack of money, no lack of investment funds. Capital flowed, if anything, into agribusiness during the past year or so. Land prices have accelerated, as you probably know. And so there was no lack of funding for many of these measures. And then I think gradually we got to a point where by the end of 2020, I think people began to see, with the rise of the vaccines and so forth, I think people began to see light at the end of the tunnel. And once people could see that there was going to be some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, a limited duration, of course, once you start to plan for the end, then clearly there's no reason to presume that there will be a permanent, lasting, and perpetual effect on the pandemic. In answer to those couple of questions that came up, if I can find them. Gosh, it's not always easy. I think.
Yes, Mr. Julian, there is have some question on the chat column.
Yes, I'm just about to deal with them now. So let's go through them. So first of all, absolutely, this point about consumer behavior, where the online retail, it's happening everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And indeed, if you look at retail generally, for example, as you probably know, in the UK, Christmas is a time when there's a huge quantity of retail spending. And for the past 2 or 3 years before COVID, there was more online spending than shops. So the process was already well underway. And to some extent, it's generational. I was exposed to online delivery very, very early on in Singapore. In 2000 in Singapore, we had online delivery. You just go onto the internet, get it done, and it would come. But that's Singapore, right? A small city, well coordinated, well organized, with the fastest internet in the world. And so in 2000, we had that experience. It still isn't that widespread here in Perth, in Western Australia, by comparison. But I don't think there's any doubt that online retail is here to stay. It's a profound effect, particularly generational effect. Absolutely no doubt about it globally, and even in Africa, beginning to actually happen. As for fresh agricultural products, I think that's a matter of planning. From that point of view, they will get delivered. They can get delivered. Of course, you can have fruit delivered, and we do. I mean, if you take, for example, Tesco's in the UK, there's a £5 delivery charge for absolutely everything. You simply go online, select what you want, and it gets delivered within a 1-hour slot, and has been throughout the pandemic. There's been no difficulty with online deliveries. In fact, the problem during the pandemic has been that the online deliveries for Ocado and Tesco and so forth has been overwhelmed by demand. There have been cases where people have had to wait days for their online deliveries to be fulfilled, simply because of the volume of demand that's coming into the marketplace. So that will gradually sort itself out. There will be more supply in terms of other companies coming into the marketplace. There will be other countries that will start to adopt this. We will start to see the end of what I call, perhaps unfairly, the wet market generation. After my mother-in-law, who is committed to going to the wet market every day, several times in Singapore, because it's a social event. It's the center of social life to go to the wet. You know how that works. But I remain convinced that process is generational, and that online delivery is likely to expand throughout. And the pandemic has simply accelerated that process by 5 years or more or so around the world, I think, in generating that. So it was already there, it was already coming, but the pandemic has definitely pushed it forward quite substantially and quite quickly. I think in that regard. So that's where I stand on that question, and I think that we should all be looking at the way that online delivery is going to shape future supply chain production, whether it's of fresh fruits or canned goods or otherwise. And indeed, it's likely to have a shift continuing in terms of impact on existing shifts. It's likely to have a further shift against canned goods, because of course, if you go to the shop once a week, you are more inclined to keep your canned goods. If you're getting deliveries more frequently because deliveries are happening regularly, then you don't have to do that. And of course, milk was the classic example of that many years ago. Do I think that panic buying is likely to continue? Less and less is the answer. We already see plenty of evidence to suggest that panic buying is reducing. We can see that people are becoming more aware of the resilience of supply chains, and globally, we can see that there is less of this. Of course, if we were to start going backwards, really quite substantially backwards. If there were a really dangerous variant of COVID that really evaded all the vaccines and pushed us backwards, then yes, then we will start to see panic buying. But that would be the first pandemic in history that went backwards. Pandemics always go in a particular direction, and this one has been no exception. What is sobering for us, I think, as human beings generally, is the way that despite all our efforts, curbing and solving this pandemic has relied on the same kinds of techniques that we used 100 years ago, the face masks and the social distancing and all the rest of it, that were all part of the plan 100 years ago. We can hope, though, that the vaccines will lead to this being resolved relatively quickly. So I think there will be local outbreaks of panic buying. Certainly there will be. But I think overall, if we had a panic buying index, I think we'd find it now well below where it was before and likely to stay well below in general. A very interesting question in terms of the impact of investment in the agribusiness sector. Now, I've been looking at this from two standpoints. One is the quantity of venture capital investment into agribusiness, and the other is in terms of M&A and overall transactions and EBITDA multiples and so forth. And the answer is on both counts that we've seen relatively little effect in terms of the volumes. We already know that in 2019, for example, the volume of agribusiness investment by venture capitalists was more than the previous 3 years put together. And that's continued during 2020. I think what it does mean, though, is that it's less likely now in the future that there will be a switch away from agribusiness investment in venture capital. We are now going to see that more sustained in years to come. And the notorious cyclicality of the venture capital industry, telecommunications this year, real estate the next year, digital the next year, blockchain the next year, and so forth, I think we're likely to see that somewhat tempered, and we will see more agribusiness funds, more funds investing in land, more funds investing in supply chains and so forth. Supply chains have been put firmly on the agenda by COVID-19 because agribusiness, although agribusiness itself might not have been so badly affected, other supply chains have been. And even where they have not been overwhelmed, as they haven't, for example, in the case of vehicles and other things, there is now much more focus on those supply chains than there was before. And where there is focus, my experience shows there is investment that will follow. And so I think that there's little doubt that if anything, COVID-19 will stimulate further investment in those areas, but you still have to have a good case at the micro level. And so I don't think we're going to see a wall of money being thrown at the agribusiness sector to make it even more. Right, final question, an excellent question here about food demand during the pandemic area. Absolutely, some demand for agricultural commodities has been rising. In the developed world, as I said, it's about people staying at home and eating. I mean, in some cases drinking. In other parts of the world, focus on basic commodities and so forth. And the agricultural sector and the agribusiness sector generally has shown an accelerated growth by comparison to other sectors. That is absolutely correct. One of the reasons the Australian economy is doing relatively well is because of the scale and the degree to which agribusiness forms a component of that industry. When things go back to normal, will we face a decline of demand in agribusiness products? Well, I think I'm relatively sanguine about this. I mean, I think the very fact that that demand has been relatively the effect on demand has been relatively modest, positive, but relatively modest. The increase in trade reflects that. The increase, there's been very little increase in valuations and so forth. I think that the extent to which we're going to go back to normal, as far as agribusiness is concerned, could be greatly exaggerated because, in a sense, we are still in normal. We are simply seeing the effect of some long-term trends, which have been accelerated. But I don't think that there's going to be any great reversal to normal, which is going to take us off in a different direction. I think we are now seeing that. And we're starting to see also in terms of media attention on population questions, in terms of the long-term need to increase agricultural production. in terms of the interface between biotech and agribusiness with new genetic productions and so forth. I think all of those things are suggesting that the interest in agribusiness and the demand in agribusiness that we're facing now is almost certainly here to stay internationally. And of course I welcome that, as I think all of you should welcome it as well. It's about time that we had our relevant place in the sun, and I think COVID-19 has demonstrated the importance of that. I'm just very, very grateful that governments haven't spoiled the party by behaving in a precipitous or dangerous way in respect of those supply chains. Generally, I think the international agribusiness supply chain has held up very well during COVID, and there are lots of people who need to be very proud of what they've done. And so I think all we have to be concerned about now as scholars is, why did we get it wrong at the beginning of last year? What can we do to make sure we don't make that kind of mistake again? And what can we say about normality going forward? Well, that's what I wanted to say today, and thank you very much for your attention. If there are any further questions people want to say or deliver, please feel free to go ahead and ask them.
Yes, okay, Mr. Julian. I think if any question, maybe can be submitted directly, please, maybe, for other people.
No questions?
No question? Okay. I think, okay, Mr. Adi, any question from Mr. Adi?
Hello, Julian. My name is Adi. Nice seeing your lecture. A very interesting point of view during this pandemic in a very broad and macro perspective. Well, I'm more concerned about the effect on this pandemic in a micro level, especially for our farmers, where, well, our farmers are smallholders, and they do not depend solely on farming. So, and I haven't found any evidence of, well, I've seen evidence in the fields that they are heavily affected by the pandemic because of the other sectors are disturbed by the pandemic, and then it multiplied their effect on their income as a household, and so it affected their farming capabilities or performance in overall. But I don't know what happens in other parts of the world. Is it the same case happening there, or?
Yes, you are quite right to point to the problems that off-farm income, declines in off-farm income pose for farmers' income. And you're absolutely right that typically, I mean, it's very difficult to generalize, but somewhere in the region of 40% or so, typically of smallholders' income comes from off-farm activities from the family. And this applies, worldwide, and applies even in the United States. What I think is important to recognize.
Sorry. Yeah. Let's continue.
What I think is important to recognize, though, is that the economic decline, such as it is, imposed by COVID-19, has not been as serious, anywhere near as serious, as, for example, what happened in the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. Now, if you look at unemployment statistics, if you look at, it's the fate of the old always to tell these stories from the past. But if you look at the hard facts, not just in developed countries, but in developing countries as well, you look at what happened in 2007, 2009, when presidents and prime ministers actually believed that the whole capitalist system in the entire world might actually collapse. Banks would go bankrupt and things would come to a stop. And we would have mass unemployment on the scale that last seen in the 1930s. If you compare that as a crisis with what's happened as a result of COVID, I think you get a sense of perspective. So that there will be, you're undoubtedly right. And I mean, I don't practice as a macroeconomist these days, but the facts are pretty clear. And if you look at all the macroeconomic statistics, you can see what they are. And I really don't think that there's any likelihood that we're going to see anything like the kind of economic falls in GDP or GDP per capita or translated through to extra off-farm activity that we saw in 2007, 2009. Moreover, unlike the crisis of 2007, 2009, we have a fairly clear idea on when this is going to end. We can actually see that it's going to end at a certain point. And therefore, we've got a reasonable prediction that we should be back in terms of off-farm income. We should be back to normal by 2022 or thereabouts. Personally, I've always been very, very optimistic about the 2020s. And nothing that the COVID crisis has demonstrated has suggested to me otherwise. So that's my answer to the question. I appreciate that's of scant comfort to a farmer in Bandung right now, in the Bandung province right now, suffering from underemployment in the family and so forth. I appreciate that. But of course, but in general terms, it's not as bad as it was before, and I don't think it's going to get any worse.
Have you done any research in Indonesia? Or?
Well, my research projects at the moment, I'm researching in Brazil, looking at how agricultural cooperatives are working there, and I'm going to propose some work in Indonesia soon. But my evidence is that incomes are down, but production and the supply chain is fundamentally unaffected. I mean, that's basically the sum conclusion. But obviously, one would require a lot more empirical research to come to some really firm conclusions about that. I'm not trying to minimize the extent of the suffering. I'm just trying to put it in a historical context.
Yeah. That's a good foundation for structuring, framing the whole context of this issue.
Yes, framing the context of the question. That's right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks, Adi.
Thank you, Mr. Adi, for the question. I'm sorry, Mr. Julian. I think there is still have one question from the chat. Yes, maybe you can answer the question on the last chat from Fiorencia.
Oh, sorry. Yes, there's more questions coming here. Let me give me 2 seconds to read them, and I'll try and answer them.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so the easiest one to answer is this question about international trading. So those traders that have specialized in particular commodities that have been not diversified and have been restricted to particular areas of trading which have been adversely affected by labor issues, such as the horticultural industry, have been badly affected. Those that have been diversified and have predominantly traded in bulk commodities, such as the really major traders, and those that have had their own facilities like Cargill and others, have been relatively unaffected by this. Their profits will be down, but not enormously. And in terms of recovery, it will take probably about a year to 18 months for the supply chain of these particular specialized commodities to get going again. Mango trade out of India, for example. The flower trade out of Kenya being a classic example. Those trades will take probably a year to 18 months to get properly going. So Adi, in terms of suffering of farmers, you're certainly going to see those that have specialized in those areas. And I'm really sorry for those that have put substantial investments into those areas over the past five years. That is certainly true. Okay. Oh, right. This question. Thanks, Ajay. This point about value chains with farmers. There is no easy answer to this. But one thing that I have striven to try and do ever since I got involved in agribusiness, when I first got involved in agribusiness in 1990, I was firmly of the belief then, and I remain firmly of the belief that transparency of pricing and the ability of farmers to engage using, hopefully, technology to interact as directly as possible with wholesalers is the best way of reducing the length of the value chain which has always been the problem in developing countries, a ridiculously long value chain where commodities go through 5 or 6 or 7 different hands before they finally reach even the wholesale, even the go downs, before they even get on to the retail environment. As I saw when I was doing my work, for example, in Pakistan on the chili market. That's where the problem is. Every individual broker taking a cut. And if you can get rid of that, then you will improve the position for farmers enormously. And that's what all my consultancy work on risk management has always been directed at doing. Increase the transparency, increase the access to storage capacity for farmers, and increase their access directly to wholesalers and ultimately even to the retail level. And that is the way forward. And the World Bank has firmly been of that view, and UNCTAD is firmly of that view, and everybody is. It's much easier said than done, but that is the right way to do it, if at all possible. That's the right way forward on that, and certainly that very much touches on what I've tried to do in all my agribusiness, and why I volunteer to do this, because I really believe that it's absolutely right. Now, very difficult, this final question. Thank you for your nice words. Yes, Oxford Economics. I know them very, very well. Yes, absolutely. They've all experienced different negative supply by events and so forth. And everyone is now talking about building supply chain resilience. So additional stakeholders into the process, different to potential sources, more vertical integration into the system, better risk management processes. Always comes down to better risk management, better forecasting, more consideration, more scenario planning, more diversification, all the standard things that we know make an agribusiness more resilient in the event that a crisis like this comes along. We all know it's really difficult when things are going well to pay attention to thinking about what happens when things go badly. But hopefully COVID-19 has, amongst many other things, taught agribusinesses, as well as many other types of business, the need to start thinking about scenario, disaster planning, and other aspects in order to be better positioned in the event that something like this ever happens again. Because it could well be that COVID-19 is just a dress rehearsal for the main event, and that we are potentially, not that I want to frighten anyone, not that this is necessarily the case, but we could see something much worse than COVID. And if we do, then all the things that people were talking about in early 2020 really could start to come about. And at that point, then we really need to be concerned about how to really make international agribusiness supply chains resilient. And I think that's a more effective use of resources, working at how we automate transportation, for example, how we improve phytosanitary controls at the border, how we reduce dependence on migrant worker labor in the event that we have to close down borders again. Those kinds of things seem to me to be a more worthwhile use of time and effort than trying to localize production and trying to roll ourselves back 100 years of international trade development. And I think that that's a battle that I'm likely to win in terms of the way that governments are going to react to this. But then I'm sure you know that, having written International Agribusiness, I'm hardly likely to be a supporter of something that reduces the capacity of agribusiness to operate at an international level. Thanks,
Okay.
Eka. Thanks very much.
Okay, welcome, Mr. Julian. Before we close this lecture, I think still any question?
Can I respond to your answer?
Sure, yeah. Please do.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your critiques about to local food production. What are your concerns? Why is it? Why you say what you say?
Look, I have no objection in principle to local food production, but I will never forget to summarize my objection, to give you an answer in one, in an anecdote. I was in Norway lecturing Norfund, which is the second largest government investment agency. They were talking about their plan for support of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's where I was there to talk about agribusiness. And in the course of my presentation over 3 days, we turned to subsidies to domestic agriculture. And Norway was the largest subsidizer of its own domestic agriculture in the world. And everyone around the table was extremely embarrassed by the slide because they recognized that the best way that Norway can help sub-Saharan Africa is by removing the subsidies to its own farmers. Not actually by supporting the farmers directly in sub-Saharan Africa at all, but actually allowing them to compete fairly with Norwegian farmers in supplying Norwegian customers. And that's the most important thing I derive from this. You know, I'm not thinking about local production in Indonesia. I'm thinking about local production in countries that subsidize, protect their own domestic production to a very large degree and prevent international trade from, and as we all know, everyone doesn't want to be subsidized. They want to trade. They want to be able to develop their own businesses. And the more ability they have to do that, the more we reduce those kinds of agricultural subsidies, the better opportunities we have to do that, particularly since we're going to see a decline in transportation costs still more in years to come and more efficient transportation networks aided by AI and by robotics and by a whole lot of other stuff. I think we are one world and we should work together as one world to feed all of us.
Okay, thank you. Interesting point of view, which is, yeah, it's far, but we're heading towards that, I guess. Yeah, you're right.
Slowly.
Yeah.
Slowly. I'm just glad that COVID-19 hasn't set us back as it might have done into a horrible rash of protectionism and
the funny thing is it came at the right time, you know, when
yes.
we were when we were all evolving our structure, and then it happened, and we're kind of ready, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would have been much worse if it had happened 20 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
Much worse.
I would love to have some more discussion with you, especially in other topics of your research, maybe next time.
Oh yes, I'm always ready, and I'll be in touch with Eka very shortly,
Yeah.
and talk about continuing cooperation.
Yeah. Thank you very much once again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Adi. Okay, any question before I close this course, maybe? Okay, I think Mr. Julian, before we close this course, I think there is a closing statement from Ibu Erna. She is a coordinator of the International Agribisnis course, Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Erna.
Mr. Erna, maybe you can unmute. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, Dr. Julian.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, even via online. And we would like to say thanks for the time and also for the great lecture for us. This is very, I think this is a really great lecture with the great topic about the impact of COVID-19 on agribusiness supply chain. And also we would like to thanks for your book about agribusiness, Agribisnis Internasional. It's very useful for us. And hopefully in the next time we will meet again via online, or also you can we can invite you to come to Indonesia and give the lecture offline to us. Thank you so much.
I'd love to come. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Erna. I'm sorry, maybe before we closing this meeting, I think we can open our video because we have a photo session, Mr. Julian. Or maybe from to other can activate the video. We can take the picture. Excuse me. Okay, we're still waiting to everyone to activate the video. So, Mr. Julian, here we have a student from Agribisnis Universitas Pajajaran, and also invited of Agribisnis study program in Indonesia. There is from IPB, from Unila, Undip, Unsri, and also Perhappy. Thank you very much to join with our guest lecture. Okay, I still waiting to everyone to activate the video. Yes, ready? I will to take the first page. Okay, first page. Okay, and second page. Yes, enough for the photo session. Thank you very much for your attention and attend to this guest lecture. And also, especially Mr. Julian Roche, very much you have given a lecture for us. I think this is a realization of our dream. We can invited you to our lecture. I hope next time, yes, you still can continue this guest lecture for our course. Okay, thank you very much for everyone. I will close this course. Thank you to join with us. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day, Dr. Julian.
And you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Makasih Pak Eka.
Sama-sama Bu Erna. Terima kasih.
Mohon Kang Eka.
Mangga.
Yuliannya udah live ya.
Enggak, Bu Dwi Rahmina. Terima kasih Ibu. Sampai ketemu lagi. Oke, Kak, good job.
Assalamualaikum. Mangga.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam. Punten Ibu.
Ya. Itu ada banyak ya yang datang ya dari PP, dari Undip, dari mana-mana ya.
Ya. Alhamdulillah cukup bagus, Bu.
Ya, oke, nanti saya lewat WA aja ke itu ya, ke Pak Eka. Oke, terima kasih banyak loh Pak Eka atas ininya ya, kerja. Good job. Di kemana wae di?
Sauman Mak. Aduh.
Iya mah sibuk.
Kopen aku Mbak. Aduh.
Agribisnis internasional ya tadi.
Jalan melulu sih.
Nggak tahu kena dari mana. Aduh. Udah.
Pak Juliannya nggak dikasih sertifikat atau apa Pak Eka?
Nanti ya saja nyusul via email aja. We can give apa ya, thanks itu ya.
Sama kasih foto-foto yang tadi juga kasih aja.
Tadi mungkin bisa.
Oke, baik, bagus materinya juga lancar. Saya nggak bisa hadir dari awal.
Ya itu langsung aja Bu tadi. Kita baru mulai, dia langsung jalan aja. Kita mulai. Saya belum sempat ngasih introduksi. Aduh, ini udah jalan aja dia. Oke.
Biasanya begitu, karena waktu kan.
Saya cek ternyata dia di Australia ternyata. Jadi nggak terlalu bermasalah sama waktu kita, cuma beda lebih cepat 2 jam aja. Iya,
lebih cepat 2 jam, makanya baguslah kirain dari sana. Ya udah tuh saya pamit ya. Thank you sekali lagi Pak Eka, good job banget, keren. Jangan lupa UAS minggu depan yang belum UAS. UAS take home atau yang presentasi terakhir minggu depan bisa absen. Pas jadwal UASnya. Ya Pak Eka, Pak Adi. Thank you ya, terima kasih atas kebersamaan 1 semester. Penutupnya keren banget Agribisnis Internasional. Ya, assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam buat teman-teman mahasiswa juga yang masih hadir.
Saya closing ya.